So let's start to talk about the return policy, understanding how your decisions can affect revenue and return performance. I'm going to pass it over to you, John, and we can dive into the information. Thank you all for joining today.
John Bowman, Chief Analytics Officer for Returnalyze. And return policy is a huge topic for the brands we work with. Excited to have our next guest.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Wesley Boyce. I am currently Assistant Professor of Practice at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I earned my PhD in Business Administration with an emphasis in logistics and supply chain management from the University of Missouri-St. Louis. I'm actively engaged in various research interests, industry engagements, such as what we're talking about here. I teach a broad array of courses in supply chain management, analytics. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, guys. Christine Bradford, I'm the VP of Customer Success here at Returnalyze. I'm excited to be here with Wes and John because I think we've got a great topic coming up. As John mentioned, this is a huge topic right now for all of the retailers we work with. Before we dive in, I just want to give a quick overview of who we are and what we do. So we're a returns analytics company, and we help retailers take returns data and turn it into revenue for the business. In addition to that, we also help retailers take returns data and apply actionable insights to the business to improve customer loyalty. So returns is awesome data that retailers don't often look at, but when a customer is returning, they're giving a signal about your product, perhaps the services that you're providing. Maybe it is your return process and your policy. And so what we do is we look at the returns and we look at how returns is impacting your business in a multitude of areas. So whether it be an assortment issue or a product issue, perhaps the manufacturer didn't create something to spec and an item is running large or small. Or maybe you're not educating your customer appropriately on the website when you're selling the item. And when she gets it in-house, the color doesn't match what she saw on the website. Or, for example, we have a retailer right now that launched a new version of a shoe. They used a new technology and customers are returning it and saying, this is not what I'm expecting with this shoe. So they haven't done a good enough job explaining why this shoe is different, what they should expect from it. Also, it could be that ship delays or the return or exchange process wasn't that easy for me. Maybe I needed a different color or size and the retailer isn't doing a good enough job there and allowing her to do so. So understanding all those friction points and all those signals that the customer is giving you allows you to then take action and course correct so that you can go ahead and increase your net revenue to your bottom line, increase the loyalty that you're getting from customers, and really improve your business by applying returns data to it. After you've done all that, you're also reducing your return rate by ultimately increasing revenue and preventing the return from happening in the future. So there are a lot of different areas, obviously, that returns touches, but today we're going to talk about return policy specifically. As we've seen in the industry over the years, it used to be common that it was free shipping, free returns, especially in the luxury space. And now we're seeing a paradigm shift where retailers are starting to charge for returns. They're starting to question their return policy. Should we charge for returns? What should it be? How should we make the change? Should we add an additional fee for extra items being returned? I'm going to ask Wes and John our first question. Should brands charge for returns? As a consumer myself, my answer is no, because I get frustrated every time I have to pay for returns, but would like to hear what John and Wes have to say here.
Yeah, I would agree with you from the consumer standpoint. If I see that there's a charge to make a return and I have any level of uncertainty whatsoever, it's pretty much a deal breaker and I'm finding the next option. But to answer the question, should brands charge? It's complicated and it depends is the vague answer. But we're certainly seeing more and more of this. It's really important to consider that the average return costs retailers at least $30. Other places I've seen say $33. Either way, it's a lot of money. And especially during COVID-19, the cost of processing returns went up drastically. A lot of outlets say the cost of processing returns went up by 3 times over that shopping boom. So the result is a lot of firms must do something, and they are. So another issue here is that return fees are growing. Research shows that return fees in roughly the past year have gone up from around 31% to 40%. So not only are consumers abusing this in some situations, but it's now costing firms more to allow them to do that. So a big problem we're seeing here is that while, this return fee that we're talking about is great, it's going to help retailers reduce the drop in revenue a little bit, but new shoppers can be deterred. Almost 2/3 of shoppers purchased a brand because they had a better return policy than a competitor. 64% of people here wouldn't buy from a brand if a competitor offered them something better. Also, 44% of shoppers care most about free shipping when making that return. These fees are a tricky scenario where firms almost need to charge for them, but consumers will not be happy with it. So in certain scenarios, yes, charge the return fee to avoid abuse, but this can steer customers away. So do it tactfully if you must. Charge that fee if someone wants to ship it back, or give them a plan B. Say, you can return this for free if you bring it to us. You do the work, bring it to our retail outlet, bring it to, the UPS store in the case of Amazon, and we'll let you have that free return.
Yeah, I agree with everything Wes said. I mean, even Amazon has come to the conclusion that they should charge for returns under certain scenarios, right? One of the most customer-focused businesses in the world. So, yes, I do think there are scenarios where you should charge, what sorts of behaviors you want to discourage, or where you have maybe extremely high shipping costs that you have to cover.
I think another area that might be interesting to look at as we see a lot of retailers start to charge for returns is it can also be added into the loyalty tiers. So if you're a loyalty member and say you shop with that brand often, maybe you waive. And so then it might also incentivize customers to sign up for the loyalty program. That's an example of something we're seeing with one of the retailers we're working with today. So as we move along, I think as retailers are starting to put together their return policy and think about, what might matter most to the customer, is it the length of time to return? Is it the amount you're charging me? What matters most in a policy? What should be taken into consideration as retailers are thinking about what the policy should be?
Yeah, I would primarily focus on communication. So if a customer is making a purchase with you and giving you their hard-earned money, then they should know exactly what happens if they can't keep the item, don't want to keep the item, or if it's defective, if they need to return it in general. We need opportunities to see a return policy here that occur over and over for this customer. Don't set it and forget it. If you're not making this something that's adaptable, then you probably have an issue here, because you want to alter this return policy as you learn more about what's working or what's not working. So look at those patterns in your returns, listen to customer feedback, really just look at the whole picture and make sure you are being flexible effectively to ensure that your policy is effective. Be as customer centric as possible with this policy. That might be the key thing that matters most in a return policy. And I know this is difficult at times because we have customers that maybe return too much or even abuse the system in general. But it's really critical to remember that customers are really concerned with returns. Some even have said that this is equally as important as payment and delivery. So it's a very big deal.
Yeah, agree with that. You should look at your returns policy as an opportunity to build trust with your customer, right? What we see a lot is the returns policy hidden, buried in the footer of your website, right? It might be written in some sort of legalese. It's not very accessible or comprehensible to your customer. And your customer may not even know what it is until they have to return something. We want the customer to be very confident, very clear when they're buying from you exactly what to expect in terms of your return policy. The other thing I'd mention is you need to understand what's your competitive landscape and how could the return policy be a differentiator that positions you favorably without going all the way to say, okay, 100% free returns in every case. How could you position yourself favorably relative to your competitors?
Yeah, I think a lot of our retailers have talked about perhaps when it's an exchange, you don't charge. If you're willing and wanting to keep the item, but you want a different color or size, return the item, repurchase it, and the retailer's not going to charge for that. We've actually had a lot of our retailers doing competitive research and finding that that was, something that was favorable in the market and working well for customers. And then if it's a straight return, taking a look at what that return fee should be. And as John mentioned, making sure you don't bury it. Nothing drives me nuts more than having to dig for that and go, where do I click? How do I click? What form do I get to? Certainly making it easy for your customers. And so that segues nicely into what are the opportunities that we see when it comes to return policy where retailers could be doing better. I know a lot of times we find that sticking with exchanges is a great way to save the sale. And if you make it super hard for someone to make an exchange, and if you add a fee on top of that, it's going to deter them from staying with you and buying with you. So we often see in the data and recommend that you make an easy exchange process. John, Wes, where do you guys see the retailers have opportunity to improve when it comes to return policy?
Sure. Yeah, definitely transparency. As I mentioned, you said, where do you find the form? Well, we see in some cases the retailer is actually requiring the customer to print out a paper form and then send it in the box. I think in 2024, customers are expecting a little more than that. There's definitely opportunity. I think using some sort of online portal gives you a lot more flexibility and control and a better customer experience. The other thing I would say is enforcement of policies. So we see a lot of cases where a retailer will put a policy in place, but then not enforce it. They'll say, okay, it's a 30-day return period, but then they're making exceptions. The financial impact can be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, even for a medium-sized retailer. If you put a policy in place, make sure that you feel comfortable enforcing.
Yeah, I would agree with that. To expand upon John's last point, with enforcement, consider your employees. They may not even know that they're not supposed to accept a return, so they need to be educated. Or the bad side of this could be the employees themselves need to be enforced, since there have been issues where they are actually abusing the return process. As Christine mentioned earlier, I would also make sure to utilize your data. You have all kinds of data on customers, sales, returns, etc. You can really learn a lot from it. So whether you can dig into the data, bring in someone else to dig into the data, you need to look at that data. We have a lot of helpful information that is hidden in plain sight. Look at your reverse logistics setup. Do you even have a reverse logistics setup? Do you have a plan for how to handle these returns? A lot of times I've seen firms don't. They just think, well, we'll just send it right back up. And that's not really how it works. And the last point I'll make here is don't forget fraudulent returns. It's an ugly area, but it's an area we need to consider. We're looking at roughly almost $8 billion a year in fraudulent returns in the US alone. And this is a good portion of all returns. So it's somewhere in the low teens. Last I saw, 13 to 14% of all returns are fraudulent. And a big part of this is about half of that is from wardrobing and bracketing alone. So we have some key actions that we can focus on here to basically help our revenue.
As you remind me of one of my favorite client stories where we actually were able to identify some fraudulent activity, and it was with their friends and family. So the friends and family were abusing the policy. And so we were able to help the retailer identify that. And they had to go back to their friends and family program and say, hey guys, you can't be abusing our policy. Otherwise we're going to take that program away. So absolutely, the power of the data and being able to identify fraudulent activity, but also maybe if your customers are not returning on time, as John mentioned, there's a lot of revenue that is there to recoup just by understanding how many customers are abusing your policy. So as a lot of retailers are adjusting their policy from free returns to adding a fee, we have a retailer that actually decided to add a fee for a secondary item and a tertiary item when, to Wes's point, she's trying on multiples and ordering multiples to kind of curb that abuse of her buying in bulk and returning in bulk. But when is the right time for me to change my policy? We know that during the holidays, retailers will expand the policy to have it be more lenient because it's the holiday period. But if I wanted to completely change my policy, when is the best time to do that?
Anytime is a good time to evaluate whether your policy makes sense. Typically, these policies remain in place for a long time. As Wes mentioned, there's often a set it and forget it idea where the policy may have been put in place at some point in the past and never really reevaluated. We're getting new data all the time. That should help us understand, is the policy effective? Is it discouraging the sorts of behaviors that we want to discourage? Is it encouraging behaviors that are profitable, which in some cases promoting exchanges is highly profitable, or in some cases encouraging the customer to try multiple items is highly profitable. So we want to be assessing those things. And if you haven't looked at your return policy in a year, now is a good time.
Agree. Anytime is a great time to reconsider this, to make sure what you have going on is working for you. Look at your return rates, make sure your revenue is not being eaten away by so many returns. So as consumers, we've been taught that returns are normal and perfectly acceptable and free. And maybe we should start to alter this perception. So this is easier said than done, of course. Firms need to start to put some effort in to actually minimizing returns in ways they can control. So it's not always the consumer's fault. Make sure our product descriptions are clear, our photos are accurate. We want to be as forthcoming as possible in making sure consumers know what they are getting to help reduce these returns. One problem we've mentioned, size variations. That's a big issue. If we can mitigate that, that could help reduce returns. Basically, any way we can minimize ambiguity from the customer perspective, we're going to increase those odds that they are actually going to keep these items. A little bit out of our control here, but consider what's happening in the world outside your industry. So we learned a lot from COVID-19 that a big wrench can be thrown into the system and increase return rates. So another reason, always revisit your return policy and be ready to change it because you might not have a choice.
Absolutely. And I think that communication piece is important, making sure that you communicate to your customers. There's been a change, especially if they're a loyal customer, they have an expectation of this is how you've always operated, and then you make a change. They should be aware of that. So once I've made my policy change, how do we understand if it's working, not working? I mentioned the retailer that decided to add an extra fee. What should we do after the policy's been implemented?
Clear that I'm a big proponent of the data. So use your data. Look for that objective evidence that what you've done is working. It's objective evidence of exactly what's happening. Always listen to your customers as well. If there's an issue, they are going to let you know about it. And then, of course, look at sales, things like that. If customers aren't content with what you're doing, they will tell you by not purchasing from you.
Look at your data. We see return rates going up across multiple industries, really the entire spectrum of retailers that we work with. That's more of a consumer behavior trend, right? That probably has little to do with whatever return policy you implement, right? So if you change your policy and make it more restrictive, you may see return rates continue to go up. We need to have some benchmarks. So if you try to place what you're doing in the context of industry benchmarks, then you can truly see the impact that your policy change may be having, right? You need to look at it over a long enough time period also, right? Many retail businesses are highly seasonal, right? There are big seasonal fluctuations in return rates. So you may need 6 months to really understand if a policy change is reducing your return rate. We want to understand, is our return policy affecting our ability to attract and retain high value customers? Is the return policy discouraging maybe low value or abusive customers from buying with us? And again, that's something that we're going to need a certain period of time to really assess the impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And making sure that you're not just looking at return rates, but customer behavior post your policy. So what is going on with the customers? Are they coming back and repurchasing from you, or Have they stopped coming back because of that change in policy? I'm going to use that same retailer example where they added an extra fee for number of items returned. What we were able to do is we took a look at, how many items were people purchasing, how many items were they returning, what the fees were, but then what was the customer's repurchase with that brand? Did they come back and buy again? Is this just a chronic behavior of certain customers where they buy in bulk, return in bulk? Was this deterring the normal customer base from coming back? And the evidence showed that the policy change was not impacting customer loyalty, and the decision for now was a good one. You're going to want to revisit the policy in the future, reassess as you collect more data, take a look at that analysis and rerun it. A couple of questions did pop in the chat. The first one was, would you recommend a different return policy for international customers? I love this question because the answer is yes. So I'll give my 2 cents and then pass it over to Wes and John. So the return policies should be different. The US market operates very differently from the EMEA market. Customer behaviors are very different in terms of shopping and returning. If you're located in the UK and you're selling to US consumers and your UK policy is return in 14 days, but you have to ship a product to me from the UK to the US, and then I have to decide if I want to keep it and get it back to you in 14 days, that might be too tight of a time frame for me. So you might want to consider for US customers lengthening that period to 30 days. So I'll stop there with my example and pass it over to the guys for a response.
Right. I'd say for international, the cost profile is different, what it's going to cost you to ship and process that return. So you have to look at that. Also, the customer expectation may be different depending on what market you're in. So what looks like a compelling return policy for US may be different than what is compelling in Australia or Germany. So definitely you should look at those things.
If you're talking about a firm that says, we'll send you a shipping label for a free return, if that's international, that shipment suddenly went from $8, $10, whatever it is, to possibly $50. So that's simply not feasible or realistic.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you can see any other questions that popped in. My screen went blank.
There's one more. Are there specific KPIs that should be considered when looking to update your return policy?
Yeah, so I think we mentioned them, but I'll try to kind of summarize. So certainly understanding the return rate post policy change and understanding if it's gone up or down. Also looking at length of time for customers to return. Return time would be another KPI. And then customer behavior with your brand. So looking at customer repurchase rates with and without a return. So comparing the KPIs of what is a normal customer's repurchase rate with you, regardless if they were returning or not. And then what happens when they do make a return, and, then profitability comes into play and things like that. John, Wes, feel free to add.
Question about Amazon's wardrobe program. So that's a very interesting one. You have 7 days to assess whether the item works for you, and then you can send it back for free, right? Amazon being a trendsetter in this industry, I think brands need to look at that and see if something similar might be appropriate.
Yeah, and I think that's an issue where we should re-educate customers. Not everyone is Amazon. Not everyone can afford that. It's an interesting development. For the KPIs question, I thought I would mention other things that I would be sure to look at. Cost per return would be a big deal. Reason for return would be a big deal as well. So that could help you identify, maybe this is a fraudulent return, or help start clarifying points about that, or even start looking at frequently returned products. Is there a certain SKU that is very problematic? You can start diving into the details of what's going on.
It looks like we have another question. So the web return rate is 6%, while the return rate on Amazon for the same exact brand or item products mix is over 20%. Yes, we do see this pattern with other brands. Marketplaces tend to have higher return rates than your specific DTC brand website. And this could be for a multitude of reasons. I can't say for sure, but some examples of the things we see. Sometimes the imagery will be off. So the way you're portraying it on your site versus the way Amazon might be showing the pictures might be different. Same goes for the description. We identified an issue with a pant that came hemmed and unhemmed. And on the direct-to-consumer website, that brand made it very clear that the pant was unhemmed and that you had to get it hemmed once you got it. Amazon did not have that in its details. So as a result, there was a return rate on that item higher on Amazon because that piece of information was missing from the site. So that would be the first place to start, is making sure that the pages are very consistent between your DTC page and Amazon. There might be other things at play here, looking at ship times and understanding if there are ship delays with the item. What is the size guide portrayed on your site versus Amazon? So it is something that we see in the marketplace, and looking at the returns data across the different channels allows us to understand what might be happening there.
I got those questions answered. Any other ones? I have a couple questions as people roll in here with some more. Is for 10 years, I sold home decor, accent furniture online. So returns, that discussion was a constant in our business model. So curious if there should be like a certain product or category that is ineligible for returns, and would that be something that is a certain price point or a certain weight? Because with accent furniture, that was, weight was definitely, dimensional weight was a constant thing that we are analyzing.
With furniture, you also have the damage issue. If it arrives damaged, you need to allow the customer to send it back. We do see an increasing movement toward final sale items. It's more about the particular item and what sort of price you're getting on it and what sort of inventory the retailer has. You should look and see if it might make sense for your business to have a more restrictive policy on certain items.
Agreed. Wes, I have a question for you about data. How much data do you need to review to make that conclusion that your change or your policy is working?
Given the prevalence of software that can easily handle large amounts of data, I would say as much as possible. Of course, there are statistical sampling methods that can give us the chance to look at a smaller portion of a much larger data set and still make statistically accurate inferences about a larger group. We certainly have to follow statistical rules to ensure validity of the data, but the more the merrier, in my opinion.
That's definitely true. I would also add that we're often able to determine with a high degree of confidence after a relatively short time period that a particular item is going to be a high returner, right? So you might be able to say with confidence after 20 returns, 50 returns, that I know this item is going to be a problem. We see that again and again.
And finally, communication. So what is the best way, if you do implement a change in your policy, to communicate to your customers, and how to communicate thoroughly to your teams internally to make sure, what are some best practices brands should be aware of to make sure that the teams know of the changes and are implementing them?
I can take that. So email, I'm going to start with email is a great, channel to communicate changes. Anyone who's opted into communication from your brand wants to know about anything that's changing. So send out an email that says our policy has changed. Not everyone's going to be opted into your email program. So making sure that it's visible somewhere on the website, maybe as she's adding things to cart or going into the checkout process, putting up just a quick disclaimer that says, hey, just to let you know, our policy has changed. And, we're now charging for returns, things like that. So between the site and any other communication channels that you have with your customers would be where I would start.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, make it as redundant as possible from the customer perspective. So put it every single page, the description page, the checkout page, the confirmation, the documentation in the shipping box. Anywhere you can include that, you should, just to make sure that they don't really have a chance to miss it.
Agreed.
And for internal teams, what's some best practices you've seen? What stakeholders should be in the room when you're rolling out a new policy change with your returns?
That's a good question. Marketing, right? Marketing is going to have to communicate it. Your supply chain cares about the logistics impact. E-commerce, they're going to have to figure out how to communicate it on the site. I mean, Christine, you can probably think of others, but it really needs to be something that involves all of the key decision makers.
Absolutely.
Customer service.
Because They're the
champion.
ones that are going to get the calls.
They're warriors. From personal experience, I saw that customer service sometimes was overlooked. They are the star player here. They're the ones that really take the ball to the touchdown. They have to implement this to the end. And then the difference of the marketing team versus the quality control. Like the volley back and forth of it's your fault. It's a QC issue. The listing's wrong. Trying to alleviate that noise was a cultural shift that we dealt with as well. So just things to consider when you get the right people in the room in the beginning, it makes things smoother. So one more question here. So what is the best way to combat fraudulent returns? What the customer entered in the portal versus what was received? Should we give the customer the benefit of the doubt?
Go
Go
ahead.
ahead, Wes.
Look at your data. Are there certain SKUs that are returned more than others? Or maybe even consider tracking items in more detail. So maybe the SKU level isn't adequate enough because a SKU could be identifying thousands of individual unique items and you don't know what you're getting in return. So maybe start thinking about the individual level by tracking items with a serial number instead, so they can be uniquely tied to that particular receipt, much like our smartphones have, for example. Maybe RFID tags, something more detailed could really help you at least start to get ahead of this battle.
The data will also be able to track customer behavior. Seeing the anonymous customer ID that you have on a person or an email address and noticing that they chronically order, 50 items and return 50 items or, 70 items and return 70 items. And it's a consistent pattern. As in you've seen them do it time and time again, that's definitely, a customer you might want to take a look at. The data will allow you to see those scenarios where customers are buying in large bulk and also returning in large bulk. That sometimes also helps identify resellers, which are people that are buying your item and trying to resell it at a higher price. But essentially, looking at your data and identifying the anomalies allows you to know where to look and start to dig in.
So I think I'd say you want to give your customer the benefit of the doubt. Typically what we see with fraudulent scenarios is it does happen again. You're going to flag it because of the volume. When you have the physical item, you have to make a judgment. We have one client who sells snowboards, and if you get the snowboard back and it's clearly been used, then you just have to follow your policy in that one.
Another great question. Would you consider a reasonable restocking fee for returns, missing parts, packaging, or slightly?
I would say that highly depends on your business and the data.
Probably we're looking at sub $10, $5. Of course, it depends, and you sort of have to look at what others are doing, what the customer expectation might be.
Also, interesting because missing parts or damaged. Did they get the item with missing parts or damaged? Whether you made the error or is it a customer fraud happening and you want to charge them. So that's also to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, I think communication plays a big part here as well. It should be clear what's going to happen if you make a return, so there's no surprise from the customer standpoint.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just going to be better to let the customer keep the item, whether they're items where the hassle of processing the return just isn't worth it.
Awesome. Final thoughts before we wrap up. Been fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing everything. Christine, anything to
No, I don't think so. It was a great discussion. I loved all the questions coming in. A lot of it boils down to using your data and your returns data to inform the decisions that you make.
Yeah, and be as customer centric as possible while also protecting yourself, also making sure that you are adequately managing these returns on your own side to ensure that you are organized.
John, any wise words in our final?
Using data to understand your customer behavior. I think that's really the key.
Awesome. Christine, Wes, John, thank you so much for your time. Sharing your expertise, and the discussion was fabulous. We definitely encourage follow-up conversation with the Returnalyze team. That's how we get the topics for our future events. So feel free to email me at tiffany@bwgconnect.com. So with that, it's a wrap. Take care and see you on another event. Thank you all. Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.